Thank you everyone for coming along. So my name's Tim Dare. I'm the head of the philosophy department here. I work in philosophy of law and political philosophy and ethics. So this topic is a bit of an intersection of my research interests, and as was said, what I want to do is, and as I hope my title suggests, is ask in the context of the Human Rights Week what human rights are and whether they are what we should be targeting, or whether there's some better account to give of the sorts of rights that we ought to be focusing on. So I want to begin by distinguishing between two kinds of rights talk, or two ways that we might use rights in discourse and argument and discussion. And the first way is a strategy or a discourse in which we use rights really as rhetorical devices or as flags. And the idea here is that people sometimes use the term rights to just to describe interests which they are trying to make clear are very important. And so they use the word right to just pick out some claim or interest which they're trying to highlight as being crucial or important. Since there are many things which are potentially normatively important, there are lots of flags, and so there are lots of rights in this sense. And so we hear people talk about rights to education, rights to life, rights to shelter, rights to dignity, so on and so on and so on. Anything that you can think might be normatively important, people describe as a right. And in more trivial or day-to-day discourse, you hear people describe all sorts of things as rights. You know, I have the right to park there, you don't have the right that I do this, you don't have the right that I do that, and so on, where the idea is that all the term right is doing is marking the claim as being important. Actually, when I found this picture, I thought this was the kind of flags picture, really. I don't know if you can read these, but I think they go prosperity, equality, freedom, justice, hope. And you know, there's an example of rights as flags. You know, that I have a right to hope, I have a right to prosperity, so on. So those are things which matter and important, and which you can imagine people in a discourse of some description trying to describe as a right. But just notice on this story there are lots of rights, because there are lots of things that are normatively important. By normative I just mean to do with norms or ought statements. So a normative statement is a you ought to do that sort of statement. Now I want to contrast this view with another view of rights, according to which rights are normative trumps. And so the idea here is that on this story, the possession of a right by one person is a sufficient reason to hold some other person under a duty to give or provide or act in ways which are consistent with the right. So what the right consists in is a claim that is in itself a sufficient reason to get someone to comply or act or desist one way rather than another. Now, the simple way to see this, the simple little example, is to think of the situation where I say to you, look, I live a long way south of Auckland, this is true, in a place called Onofero, and I find I've left my wallet at home. Can someone lend me $10 so I can get the train home? And I'm asking you as a favour, let's suppose, this is only hypothetical. I'm asking you as a favour. Now, that kind of request or claim is very different than the one in which I say, look, I lent you $10 last week and you promised me you would pay it back when I asked for it, and I need it now and I'm asking for it. In the second case, I'm asserting a right to the $10, and if you respect my right, you have to pay me the $10. In the first case, where I say, look, I've done something stupid and left my wallet at home, can you spot me $10? I'm hoping you'll do the right thing for me, but you don't have to. And it doesn't much matter how good my reasons are. You know, if I say I need a kidney transplant, I need $10, or you know, my daughter needs a kidney transplant, I need $10. doesn't matter how good the reason is, the first kinds of pleas or requests are just conceptually different. They're asking for things as a favour or a grace or a plea, rather than the one we say, I have a right to the $10, give it to me. And so the idea then is that rights on this story is normative trumps. By trump I mean, when we're having some argument about something, will you give me the $10? If I have a right, I can play my right, and you've got to comply. It's the winning trick in this sort of discourse. And so rights on this story are very special kinds of normative claims, and they are perhaps the most powerful normative claims they are. And one of the things which is driving my view is that I think it's crucial that we maintain that view, that we have these very powerful normative claims, which are not just a matter of request or plea or favour, but we can demand their performance. And so we can contrast this notion of rights as trumps with appeals to the common good, to it would be good that if such and such happened. And here are a few examples, I hope. If I have property rights in my home, if I own it, then it can't be taken from me, even if it would be best, all things considered, if it was. And it may well be. It might be that actually, if you took my house from me and sold it, allowed me to buy a much more modest house, not that I live in a mansion, but allowed me to buy a much more modest house and spread the money around, you would do a lot more good than just letting me keep my house. But I don't even have to defend myself against this kind of plan. I just say, it's my house, I own it. And that settles that you can't sell my house, even though it would do a lot of good if you did. Or, one you might find a little more plausible, if I have a right not to be tortured, and I do under the UN Declaration of Human Rights, I'll come back to that declaration a bit later on, if I have a right not to be tortured, you're not allowed to torture me, or the state's not allowed to torture me, even though everyone might think it would be a good thing if they did. So suppose I'm one of the suspected 9/11 terrorists, and you think I know where Osama bin Laden is hiding, and for some reason we think it would be a jolly good thing to catch him. That all might be true. I might know. You might be able to get it out of me by torturing. But if I have a right not to be tortured, we don't even have that discussion. And notice we don't have the discussion in either direction. It's not that I say, well, a lot of good would come out of me, torture me, but still you can't torture me. And I don't have to say, torture's a very unreliable way of getting information. If you torture me enough, I'll tell you anything, which is one objection to torturing. That's a kind of consequentialist objection, right? It says don't torture because actually it's not very efficient. But that's not a rights claim either. I can say, you can't torture me because I have a right not to be tortured, and all of the policy, the right, the cost-benefit analysis just goes out the window. So these are rights as trumps. Another couple, if I have a right to freedom of expression, I can't be silenced, or you can't silence me as a matter of right, no matter how uncomfortable the things I say make people feel, or how obnoxious I am. I can say unpopular, obnoxious things. If I have a right to freedom of expression, you can't stop me because it would be best, all things considered. If you do that, this is one of the great liberal dilemmas. We liberals have to put up with people we really don't like very much. And we think because they have rights, we're stuck with them. And finally, if the members of a minority, say a minority culture or a minority religion or what have you, if they have rights to be treated as equals, they can assert that right. They can say, I have a right to be treated as equal, and we can't even go down the path of thinking, gee, it really would be good if we could take their land, or if we could stop them dressing in that funny way that we disapprove of, or whatever. We don't even get into that discussion about whether it would be really good if we could oppress them. The point of the right is precisely that they can play the trump and say, it doesn't matter how good it would be if you treated me this way or that way, I have a right that you not do it, and that settles it. Actually, just as a footnote, some people object to the rights as Trump's view precisely because they say it stops discourse. They say, if you want to have a discussion about what you ought to do, you have to be a bit wary about people playing rights trumps too early because it stops the discussion. But there's a footnote. I won't go into this here. All right. So the idea here then is that I want these two views, that there are rights as flags or rhetorical devices, where all the rights talk does is mark this out as being very important. So when I say I have a right to life, notice that might be a very funny thing to play as a trump, actually, a reason I'll come back to. But if I say that just as a flag that life's important, religion's important, but it's not that I think it's a trump, that I'm just trying to mark it as an important consideration in the political discourse. Whereas if I think that I have a normative trump, once I play the right, that's the end of it. It actually has normative significance. And one of the things I want to do is defend this view that we should think of rights as normative trumps, not as mere rhetorical devices or flags. Why do this? Why prefer rights as normative trumps over the rights as flags view? Well, the most obvious reason is because we need normative trumps. We disagree about things. We, particularly communities like ours, are marked by a plurality of views about controversial issues, about whether euthanasia is permissible, about whether abortion is permissible, about whether you can teach education in schools, about decent taxation systems, about how to spend the health dollar, ... We have these disagreements, and if we just allow it to be decided by minorities or force, then minorities and minority interests are going to suffer. So we need these trumps to guarantee that some interests will be protected against cost-benefit analysis, that some things are out of the cost-benefit discourse. And so the first thing is that we need these trumps in order to give ourselves security. We need to be able to guarantee various things, that certain interests will be guaranteed, will be protected against the intrusion of cost-benefit analysis. We don't want to just allow people to say, well, we know that that land belongs to your people, but really it's awfully expensive. You know, we could make better use of it if we had it, so we're going to take it, and we're the majority. We want to guarantee that the protection of certain kinds of interests doesn't depend on convincing other people that they ought to respect our interests. So notice, this is going to become a little bit clearer in the next step, but on one of the aspects of the cost-benefit discourse, you might think, is that what I try and do is convince people that they really should agree with me about my view. They should let me keep my land, or my culture should keep their land or their traditions because it's a good thing. If I have a trump, a right, I don't need to convince them. Now, I might want to convince them because I might think it's best if they agree with me, but I don't have to convince them. I can play the trump at the point where they say, look, we're not convinced. I can say, oh, well, that's pity, but I have a right. And so we want to take some kinds of claims out of this discourse. And so that's the next thing. So you don't want to have to depend, if you're a minority, you don't want to have to depend, you don't want your claims to depend on convincing the majority that they ought to respect you. Of course, it's a good thing if they do, but if they don't, you want to be able to say, well, tough. You know, I have a right, and you can't impose your view on me. So that's basically why I think we should prefer them. Now, we can make those points, by the way, about so this is sort of, you know, talking at sort of pretty broad, in context of pretty broad political rights. We can make them in trivial rights too. So the $10 debt, you know, why do I want a right as a trump over my $10 debt? Because I don't want to have to convince you when I need the $10 back that really it would be best if you gave it to me, and worry about whether you'll agree and so on. At some point I just want to say, look, it's mine. You know, end of story. And the guy at the garage who spent, you know, 20 hours fixing my car, when I turn up to pick the car up, or worse for him if I picked it up the night before when he wasn't there, and he rings for his money, he doesn't want to depend on having to convince me that really it would be best, all things considered, if I paid him, you know, where I might be sort of disagree. I might be right, of course. It might be, you know, that I've got all these pressing needs for the money and it's more important to me than him. But he doesn't want to have to go through that. He wants to say, look, I fixed the car, you agreed, you pay me, you owe me $300 or something. And so these are kind of trivial versions, but again, notice that the rights are trumped in this. Now, I want another distinction between rights and human rights and conventional rights. So this is Human Rights Week, and so one thing to do is to talk a wee bit about what human rights are. And I'm going to start with the idea that what a human right is a right that we possess by virtue of being human. And so this actually gets a bit trickier than I'm going to try and spell out here. But the idea goes that there's some set of features that humans have. We feel pain. We flourish best in certain kind of communities. Loving relationships are important to us. We have the capacity for reason. We can read and inquire and question. We are possibly unique in that we can be the authors of our own lives. So I can design my life so that it goes a certain way. Most other animals we don't think can do that. They're kind of bits of flotsam according to the seasons and desires and so on. But we are these important rational creatures. And the idea goes that we can spin a set of rights out of those natural features. And the rights are the things that we need on some of these accounts in order to give effect or to express these facts about humans. So this is where it gets a bit murky, because who knows how you get from the fact to the value. But the fact is that human beings flourish if they live in conditions of security where they can inquire. So we have a right to security. We have a right to seek knowledge. We are the kinds of creatures who can express views and discourse, and so we have a right to freedom of expression and a freedom to receive information. The and so is very murky there, actually. And candidly, I don't believe it for a moment, but I won't go into that. Just how we get from the fact of these things to rights is pretty odd. But that's the basic idea, that what a human right is a right that we possess by virtue of being human. And sometimes we talk about universal human rights. Well, why are they universal? Because presumably these facts about human beings are universal. All humans have these capacities to inquire. All human beings, it matters to them that they live in, can have live in security, that they can have loving relationships, that they can have respect, that they can inquire, and so on and so on. Regardless, notice, of gender or race or ethnicity or religion. That stuff's all just kind of contingent bits and pieces. Beneath all of that, we're all human, and so the human facts are the same about us, and so the human rights will be the same about us. And so we get, next slide. So we get this idea that there's some set of human rights which rest upon these facts about us, and they are distinct from the contingent facts. Whether my parents were rich or poor, whether I'm, built as I am or built like Sonny Bill Williams, whether I'm clever or stupid, whether I'm black or white, male or female, that's all kind of detail. We're all human, that's what we have in common. So the contingent facts are put aside. Now we can contrast this with conventional rights. What conventional rights are rights we possess by virtue of belonging to certain kinds of conventional systems. So social systems, legal systems, political systems, and so on, which give us certain kinds of rights. So many of the rights I have, the most obvious ones I have because I live in New Zealand under a particular kind of legal system, and there's a such and such act. There is the Crimes Act 1961, which has a whole bunch of rights in it, and that's not a very good example. They're funny rights, but nonetheless, what they do is they give me a right against the state, that the state will stop you beating me, or so on and so on. Or the Sale of Goods Act gives me rights, or the Credit Contracts Act, or so on and so on. And there's a whole bunch of them. And actually, interestingly, in New Zealand, one of those things is the Bill of Rights Act, which is just an act, which gives me certain kind of rights to be treated as equal before the law, and to freedom of expression, and so on and so on. And so I have those rights, not by virtue of my humanity, but by virtue of the fact that I live in a certain kind of community. I'm a citizen of a certain kind of conventional system. And there may be lots of these, of course, so the legal and political systems are the obvious ones, but there are social systems and so on. The contrast is just that there are some rights. These are not human rights in the sense that I have them by virtue of my humanity. They are contingent, conventional rights. And this is roughly what I'm going to defend, actually. I'm a deep skeptic of human rights, and I'm in favour of conventional rights. So what I'm going to try and do is say that we shouldn't worry too much about human rights. We should really focus on conventional rights, and that's not such a bad thing. It's a bit, initially a bit troubling, But once you see how good conventional rights are, you become a convert. That's the theory. Now, why? So I've said that I'm going to try and convince you that we should go for conventional over human. And so the next question is why? Why would we prefer human rights as opposed to conventional rights or vice versa? Now, there's one very obvious reason to like human rights. That is, if they are grounded in these universal, again, universal a bit murky, but let's just say universal facts about humans. So we all suffer pain, we all experience pleasure. So there are certain kind of facts about us. We all flourish best in systems where we can have access to knowledge and so on. If those are facts, then it really is universal. And we know from bitter experience that conventions can get things awfully wrong. So Nazi Germany, racist South Africa, so on and so on. All the examples you can think of where individuals were denied equality, were treated appallingly under conventional systems. So at least in the early part of Nazi Germany, the actions against the Jews and the gypsies and homosexuals and so on were done according to laws, to conventional laws. And one of the great troubling facts for someone interested in the theory of law is that a lot of those laws were conventionally impeccable. You know, whatever was wrong with them, it wasn't that they weren't passed in the right way and so on. What was wrong with them was their moral content, not their conventional content and their conventional structure. So we know that conventional systems can be awful, and so we get this in the Article 2 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Everyone is entitled to all of the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, such as race, colour, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth or other status. So that's the universality condition. And the idea is that human rights can be used to test conventional rights systems. So it doesn't matter that the South Africans in the 1970s or 80s got it wrong and treated their black citizens as though they weren't equal. The convention wasn't up to the conventional system. These people had human rights, and those human rights weren't the kind of thing which could be varied by convention. So that's the most obvious reason to like human rights, but there's a problem. The problem is that I think that the role of rights as trumps. So once we see that it's important that rights are trumps and not merely flags, we have a reason to go for the rights as the conventional model of rights rather than the human rights model. And the most obvious reason is that one of the important functions of rights in communities like ours, so again, pluralist communities, you look around this room, there are people of different ethnicities and probably different religions. You can't tell from looking at people, but probably different religions and certainly different genders and so on and so on. We have different backgrounds. And in communities like ours, there's bound to be disagreement. It's just, John Rawls says somewhere that it's the inevitable effect of allowing people to live together under free institutions. If you just kind of let people like us live and read and commune with people, we will end up disagreeing. We come up with different views about things. It's just actually it might be one of the natural facts about human beings. And so what we have to do is find ways that we can live together despite our disagreements. So what we need to do is find a way that we can cooperate together, notwithstanding that we disagree about the morality of abortion, of compulsory religious education, of euthanasia, of taxation, of free education as opposed to private education, so on and so on. And so we need some way that we can settle those disputes. So one sort of example then is just to, one way you can put this is to say that we disagree about what rights our humanity generates. So we might agree on the facts about what humans are. We may not actually, so that could be quite controversial what the crucial facts about humans are. But suppose we settle that somehow, then we're going to disagree what right does the capacity for knowledge and to seek knowledge generate? what is the right that couples on there? What rights come out of the fact that we can feel pain? What rights come out of the fact that we flourish best if we live in secure communities with loving, possibility of loving relationships, and so on and so on. And so one way to think about this is to think of a little example. Think of the euthanasia case. So in New Zealand, this is not currently a hot topic, but it's something that's kind of simmered away for 2 decades now. It's been to Parliament twice in the form of a bill and been defeated, where there's been this sort of simmering discourse or discussion about whether or not euthanasia should be decriminalised or not. And you can imagine the human rights talk. One person says, well, people have a right to life and it's non-waivable. You can't give up your right to life. It turns out to be one of those rights. Often a kind of religious background to this. And so it's not up to individuals to choose the end of the time of their death. Doctors have a human right to autonomy. They can't be involved in this sort of thing, and so on. So you get one kind of rights discourse saying euthanasia's out. On the other hand, of course, you get people saying, well, people have a right to live with dignity, and dying with dignity is part of living with dignity. It's a sort of important part of it. And so there's a human right to have dignity, and that right to have dignity generates a right to be able to choose when you've had enough, and so to ask for assistance to die. So the rights talk about euthanasia can just take us in 2 different directions. And so there's a problem if we want rights to be trumps, to tell us what we can do, if we can't agree on what the rights are. So if the disagreement about euthanasia, if what it seems to show us is it's not going to be settled by appealing to human rights, understood as these rights which are generated by humanity, because actually the disagreement about euthanasia is a disagreement about our human rights. So it happens to be about euthanasia in this case. But actually, it's at bottom a disagreement about what our humanity requires and allows. And most of our deep moral divisions or disagreements will be the same. Think of abortion. You know, is there a right to abortion? Well, some people think there's a right to life, and it extends to conception, and so that makes abortion wrong. Some people think there's a natural human right to autonomy, and that gives women the right to control of their fertility and their body. And so you can't say, well, let's settle whether abortion is legitimate or not by settling what the human rights are, because, well, in that case, we don't quite agree what human is. We're not quite sure whether the zygote's a human or not. When the zygote or the fetus or whatever becomes a human, and even if we agree about that, we're not sure what it settles. And so one of the most famous papers in this area says, look, let's suppose the fetus is a human, suppose the mother's a human. You've just got a kind of competition, haven't you? You know, who's right wins. And so human rights are not going to settle that debate. And so the idea then is that we might think we need to find some other way. And my suggestion is that the conventional rights approach provides us with the solution. So if we want rights to be trumps, we shouldn't rely upon human rights, because some people put it, what they are and what they mean is essentially contested. We're just never going to get agreement over it. Whereas the conventional rights, we might hope, look a bit more promising. Now, so the rough idea here is that the conventional rights solution is the idea that somehow, despite our disagreements over what rights we have and what they require, we can secure agreement or consensus by proceeding through the mediation of models of rules or sets of rules. So the idea is that we can't always agree on what we ought to do, what rights we have, but we can agree on procedural systems which will do things like allocate rights, and those rights will be able to function as trumps, and therefore allow us to live together despite our disagreement. Now, to put a little bit of extra detail here, you can contrast, think of an example. Suppose we're having a disagreement about what a fair taxation system is. So just to make it simple, suppose I think that the taxation system should be radically progressive, so that people should pay much more tax. Rich people should pay much more tax than they do. So, you know, the people who get on the wrong side of the road, one of the things that's going to happen to them is that they're going to be taxed to hell. And you think, actually, no, this is a mistake, that really people have a human right to own their property, they mix their labour with things and they get to own it. And so taxation is prima facie theft, and so there's much too much tax. And you can imagine us sitting down and arguing about this. Now, in the first instance, what I try and do is convince you that I'm right. And so call this a first order discussion. I give you all the reasons I can think of to think that really people don't own the property they earn, there's no reason that we shouldn't distribute it more evenly, that justice matters, that distributive justice is important, and I'm trying to convince you to change your mind. And you're trying to convince me to do the same thing. You're trying to convince me that your view is right, and that I should change my mind and agree with you. And that's how we proceed in the first part of the discussion. Now, after a while, we might think this is really getting nowhere, and notice we have to do something. So we can't have no taxation system, we might both agree with that, and we can't just leave this, because leaving it means that one person will win. So this isn't one of those options where you can decide, oh, well, let's just flag it and not do anything about it. Doing nothing amounts to doing something. So what we might do, plausibly, is move to a second order decision procedure. And a very plausible one, a bit corny in the political context, is to say, let's flip a coin. So you and I agree that we'll flip a coin, and whoever wins the coin flip, their view prevails. And we flip the coin, and you win. Now, I have a reason to go along with you and cooperate with your preferred tax system. But notice the reason I have, called a second order reason, is of a different logical kind than the reason you were trying to give me when you were trying to get me to change my mind. I don't have to think you're right to think that I should cooperate with the coin flip. I can hold on to my first order view. I have a second order view, namely I should cooperate with the coin flip, which operates independently of the first order view. So things like decision procedures, coin flips, votes, all sorts of things, are second order reasons which don't depend for their normative force on convincing people that they're right. There are lots of laws I feel bound by that I think are doping. I don't have to agree with them in order to see that I have an obligation to cooperate with them. The point of them is that they give me a second order reason for action. And so the idea then is that there's something striking about this. This model of resolving our disputes at the second order level leaves people's first order views untouched. You don't have to change your mind about what a fair taxation system would be, but you can say, okay, I should cooperate with the second order system. And so this model is oddly tolerant. It leaves people to hold on to their own view if they want. There's no reason for you to change your mind. I give up on that. I don't try and say, look, you're stupid, you've made a mistake, you're evil, you're wicked, you know, whatever. I just say, look, I tried my best to convince you, I failed, but I won the coin flip. Well, you won the coin flip. We're going to do whatever the coin flip requires. Now notice the first order discussion can go on, and does. You know, you can argue, look, you know, I still think we've made a mistake, and I can say, okay, let's talk about it again, and then somewhere down the track we might flip the coin again, or have another vote, you know, or whatever. So the first order discussion, where we try and change one another's mind, goes on and on and on. You know, that's part of the human predicament. But in the meantime, we can use these second order decisions to decide what we'll do. Now the idea, of course, is that that's the way conventional rights systems work. Our legal system is not a coin flip, of course. It's much more complicated. It has courts and judges and all sorts of things. So that's not what we have. What we have is not coin flips, but complicated legal systems and an agreement to abide by their decisions. But we abide by them as the second order decisions, as the second order conventional decisions where what the law does is give me rights. And so I disagree, you and I disagree over tax. The law makes a decision, it puts in place rights. The tax commissioner has a right to demand tax from me. And now that right is my reason for action, not my first order belief about what a fair taxation system would look like. And so the idea then is that that's what conventional rights do. Now, just some sort of notes to wrap up. By notes is not quite right. These are miscellaneous points or little sort of wrap up bits. First, second order decision procedures or conventional rights on this story are not divorced from first order morality. In any sensible system, you try and make your conventional rights track first order morality, insofar as you can know what it is or get agreement. And so there's ongoing, in sensible places, there's an ongoing process of compromise between the reasonable first order views. And you see this in our political system, imperfectly, probably. We have an argument about whether parents can bash their children in order to make them better. We argue and argue and argue, and then we repeal Section 59, and for the moment at least Section 59 settles what I can do to my kids. And then the years go on, someone says that's a stupid law, and we have the debate again, and we come back, and that's the way decent legal systems work. Part of the point is to recognise that the conventional legal rights are just kind of pro tanto, temporary, rough compromises. This is a kind of rather tragic view of rights, of course. If only I were king, we could just do what I wanted. But what I know is that I don't have a better judge of any of that stuff than anyone else, and I can't oppress you. So I have to think I'm just sort of stuck with the second order model. Second, it's not divorced from morality or first order morality, because there are important moral reasons to respect conventional rights, even though we recognise they're mere compromises. And namely that I recognise that people who I think are wrong, but not stupid or wicked, disagree with me. So I have strong views about lots of things. I know people disagree with me, and I think they're wrong. But I don't have the power to compel them, and wouldn't want to. It's expensive and difficult and inefficient. And so I have a reason to cooperate with them. So I have a moral reason to respect the conventional second order decision procedures. Now, given sufficient consensus, we might simply list, indeed, in our conventions, a whole lot of human rights. And that's actually what the UN Declaration of Human Rights looks like. Actually, I should say, a lot of those things are not really plausibly human rights. I think I said last night, one of the rights under the UN Declaration of Human Rights is a right to move freely within political borders. That can't be a human right, because borders are not natural things. That's got to be a conventional right, because states are conventional. And there are other ones in there. There's a charming right to own property, actually. That can't be a human right, can it? I mean, unless you're Lockean and think somehow you mix your language. But it's a pretty strange human right. Lots of those things are actually conventional rights. They've got to be. But you might just list them. But notice something about it. Even when you do this, even when you list them, their force as reasons for action comes not from their status as human rights, but from the fact that they have been listed in a conventional rights document. Why does the UN Declaration of Human Rights have effect over me? It's because New Zealand has signed various treaties, the New Zealand government has signed various treaties and brought the UN Declaration of Human Rights into New Zealand law. So it's a conventional right, that's its status, even if it does list human rights. As human rights, it doesn't mean anything to me very much, because I think most of them are a bit dopey. I don't think they can plausibly be rights, actually. But as a bit of New Zealand law, they're conventional rights, and they act as rights and trumps in the same way as everything else. What about when there's disagreement about what conventional rights mean, and that plainly happens? We have some conventional right which says, so in New Zealand we've got under the Bill of Rights Act, Section 14 or something, there's an alleged right to freedom of expression, right to impart or receive information of any kind, any form, ... It's a freedom of speech provision. Now, it's a pretty strange bit of legislation, actually, or a bit of strange bit of law, and you can imagine a long argument about what it means, especially the bit that I have the right to impart information. What does that mean exactly? What if you're just a bit dim and I can't get it into you? Or what if, no matter how often I keep saying this, you don't understand, or you just refuse? You go, blah, 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 blah. Are you violating my right? It just sort of kind of seems strange. So suppose we have an interpretive problem. Can we then appeal to the human right in order to tell us what the conventional right means? And the answer is no, because the point of the conventional right is that we disagree about what the human right means. That's why we've got the conventional right. So you can't use the underpinning human right as a strategy for interpreting the overriding conventional right, because otherwise you're appealing to the very thing you disagreed about when you were which you were trying to settle by passing the conventional right. This is a conceptual constraint on the interpretation of laws. Laws can't rely for their interpretation on appeal to the very matters which were under dispute and which the law was intended to settle. If they do, then the law is made redundant. And so no, you can't. So again, we need to rely upon conventional rights. Now, I think the last thing I've got up here is a long quote from Hobbes, which I'll just leave, even though I love him. So the point of all of this is just to say, human rights are not going to cut it. In communities where there's reasonable disagreement about what people's humanity means and what rights they generate, what right it generates, we can't rely upon human rights. We've got to rely upon conventional rights, which can function as trumps, and only conventional rights can function as trumps, and so we should abandon human rights and go for conventional rights. That's the... Thank you. So I'm happy to take questions. I'm not sure whether... Yeah.
My question is related with the first and second orders, and between the human rights and conventional rights. Concerning the Sharia law in Muslim countries, Islamic countries, and if I understand well, the first order of the human rights is controversial with the first order of the conventional rights. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, just missed you. Just lost it a bit at the end. So we had
Sharia law. I'm
Sharia
sorry
law,
if there is the Muslim students here,
yeah.
and if I am a little bit aggressive against Sharia law, but I've heard that that is one of the most segregational conventional rights for the male citizens. Sharia law for the Muslims.
Yeah.
And so, if I understand well your theory, then the first order of the human rights is the controversial with the conventional rights of the Muslim country, as far as the Sharia law is not acceptable in the point of view of the human rights.
Well, so I'm not an expert on Sharia law, actually. Probably is my pronunciation of its name shows. But there's certainly, so I don't think there's anything about shifting the conventional system which says we can't criticise conventional systems' rights. And indeed, one of the things I think we do, so I said the first order discussion carries on. One of the things presumably that first order discussion will do is appeal to natural facts about human beings. So if it were true that there are legal systems, and we don't need to talk about Sharia law, presumably, look at the legal systems of racist South Africa, or so more uncontroversially wicked legal systems. You can say what was wrong with the legal system of South Africa at the time, when it was racist, and apartheid South Africa, was it failed to recognise that actually there's no significant moral difference between blacks and whites. And so to the extent that the law didn't recognise that, it made an error. And that's a first order claim. There's no significant difference between blacks and whites. It refers to facts about human beings. That's a good reason to change the law. What you can't do is simply say that is the law. That is the first order reason to settle what the rights are. So I'm a moral optimist, actually. I think we're kind of making progress slowly but surely in most areas. So I don't think any of these legal systems, including ours, is beyond criticism. I think our conventional legal systems, obviously, there are lots of things wrong with them, and that's why I said, why is the human moral law attractive? Well, because it gives you the standard to say what's wrong with the laws of racist South Africa is blah, blah, blah. But my claim is that the first order discourse is not going to give us the means for rights which can function as trumps, which will settle what we should do in those cases. Yeah. Yes,
on me. With regards to conventional rights, what would I agree with your distinction between human rights and conventional rights, but in terms of how how we use human rights as it is. I think this was a discussion yesterday
Sorry.
that wasn't really well developed in the actual lecture itself. But if we use conventional rights to justify intervention in another area, because with the preconceived notion that by acting on the belief of those rights, that they would then agree to them posthumously. So the use of conventional rights in a different scenario, whereby you could actually justify having imposing an absolute like human rights and justifying it on the basis that they would agree with it later on. What?
Right, but may well be posthumously, of course. So one of the things, as I think, as I said in passing, I think this is a slightly tragic story. It would be so much better if we really had consensus on first order moral matters and we could appeal to them, but we just don't. And I'm not a moral skeptic, by the way. I mean, I think there really are moral truths, first order moral truths. I just think that we're very unlikely in our community to get agreement on what they are, and we can't enforce them. So in the humanitarian intervention case, I'm not sure which, I was rather confused which side of that debate I was meant to be on last night. The topic was a very odd subject. But anyway, I think there've got to be cases where humanitarian intervention is justified. So suppose that suppose that the Allies, suppose we'd had the opportunity to go into Rwanda and stop the genocide, and we'd had the will and the clout to do it. I think we should have done it. Now, what would make it okay to do it, I think, is just you have to have a certain kind of careful political discourse among as many of the actors you can get together. So this is just what morality is, I think. We just sit down and give reasons to one another and build constructions and construct arguments openly, recognising that they are just the best we can do here and now. We're trying to track ordinary morality, but we can't guarantee we'll do it. And at some point you've got to have the courage to say, we're confident enough in our assessment that we're prepared to use force in this area. Now, you better not do it too often. But I think there must be cases where you just think, of course we might be wrong about this, but after careful consideration, this is the moral story we tell. Now, the justification, I think, is not that anyone will agree with you post facto. It's that you can say here and now why you can justify your actions here and now in just ordinary moral reasoning. And I think we can't demand that be grounded in timeless moral truth, because we just don't have those available to us. What we've got to do is say, on the best information available to us about what will generate the best outcomes, what will respect people as far as we can, avert a great risk, this is what we think we have to do. So I have kind of a modest view of moral discourse, actually. I think it really is just like this sort of practice. We could sit here and say, should we do this? And people would give reasons and arguments, and we would try and respond carefully to one another and put together a case. That's what morality is about, I think. Yeah.
My comment was, it's more like a comment, but I'd like to discuss it, was that human rights, I think, are contingent on conventional rights. So therefore that's why when the argument about pursuing conventional rights and strengthening those, human rights are a position of moral and maybe religious, or they can be shaped by that. So if that's a human right, conventional rights are more like an agreement or societies and such. So they're relying on that. So if you don't have those contingent conventional rights, you can't uphold and enforce the human rights.
So I think I agree with the last bit. So I think one thing that you might think you do with conventional rights is actually try and specify, what we have to do to as best we can respect very broad human rights, or whatever we can call them, moral rights. And so suppose, I'm not sure that I believe this, but suppose there's a human right to be free of unnecessary suffering. Plausible, I guess. That's a good moral aim. but now, of course, what does that mean exactly? And what should we do in order to put effect to that? What does it mean for the speed limit? What does it mean for a social welfare system? All of that sort of detail have to be specified by conventional rights, because you're just not going to get it out of human rights. And one objection I have to the UN Declaration of Human Rights is, if you look at it, it's got all sorts of things in there about people having a right to social welfare. And that just seems to me as terribly, politically contingent. I mean, you can imagine a perfectly just society where there's no social welfare. You can imagine a perfectly just society where there's no property. I mean, so I agree with that. I didn't get the first bit where you said that human rights were actually. I mean, is that what you meant by saying that human rights were dependent on conventional rights?
That kind of, but it's more that you can have all of these human rights and all of these thoughts and wants and needs, but if there aren't any conventional rights there agreed upon by the society, those human rights have no way of being upheld.
Yeah, no. So I agree with that. The bit that I thought. So what I want to resist is the idea that actually human rights, the content of human rights depends on conventional rights. I don't think it can go that way. I think it can be true that whatever human rights are, they are powerless without a structure of conventional rights. Actually, someone to read on this is Aquinas on natural law. So Aquinas thinks that there are natural laws, and the most basic one is do good and avoid evil, is the key one. And then you've got all these secondary natural laws, don't harm, educate, so on and so on. And then you've got human law on top of that, which tells you what all of those natural laws mean, especially the first one, because do good, avoid evil is a spectacularly unhelpful bit of moral advice, because you just go, well, what does it? Yes, I'm trying to do that. Should I end this person's life who's suffering terribly from a terminal disease? What counts as doing good and avoiding evil? And so Aquinas thinks that the human law fills in all the details. So that is that sort of view. So it's sorry.
Yeah, I think you said somewhere in passing that we get this moral disagreement when we're having a moral disagreement.
Yeah.
Because we can't impose, even though we might be right, we can't impose our moral. But
yeah.
I wonder, is it a moral belief that we can't impose? Or is it just a pragmatic?
Well, I think it's probably a bit of both. So one of the things is that imposing, we tried imposing moral beliefs. So this is a story about pluralist communities. So a story about communities like ours. Again, just look around the room and see the kind of different people here, and have a guess about the range of different moral and political and ethnic views you're going to come across if we begin examining. There are cultures, though maybe this is a myth, but there are cultures. So the Greeks, allegedly thought there was one basic view of the good life, and the job was to impose it on everyone, get everyone to agree with it. And there might be very small religious communities, the Mennonites and the Amish, maybe, where there's sufficient moral consensus that people agree. But in our community, it's not just that it would be immoral for me to try and make you all agree with me on moral terms. No, it would be, because I have no more grounds for confidence in my moral view than you have in yours. Again, I'm not a relativist. I think you're wrong. but I can see the moral truth, but I can see that reasonable people disagree. But furthermore, it's just sort of hopeless. What exactly would I do to get you all to agree with me morally? We can't get people to stop smoking, for God's sake. Let alone stop whatever wicked things you do. So the imposition strategy is just enormously expensive. It's ongoing. I think so. Actually, Rawls does say this somewhere. We've just sort of given up. And a good thing too. We've just come to think actually, pluralist communities are kind of wonderful. And one of the things that the moral defence of the conventional system is that tolerance, that it allows us to live together notwithstanding that we disagree about things. We don't need agreement to have stable community. That's one of its beauties of it. Yeah.
Coming from the basis that truth exists, without any at all description or definition of what that is, what that means. My question is, if reasonable people disagree, and that's the reason why second-order conventional rights are to be referred for the sake of society, then isn't the problem our conception of the reason part? Reasonable people disagree. Is the problem about the reason which people that are disagreeing?
Well, so if I understand you, I don't think so, because I think you can believe that there are moral truths, and think that fully informed people with all of the facts in front of them will disagree about, for instance, the proper weight to be given to various components. So how do you weight autonomy over the relief of suffering? So imagine some case with a whole bunch of factors. There are autonomy issues, there are suffering issues, there are benefit issues to third parties, and so on and so on. We can all agree on what the facts are, but we give them slightly different weight, and we can explain why we think that's the most salient feature in this case. And so that can lead us to disagree about the right thing to do in the case. Now, it may be true that some kind of moral Hercules, or some super moral agent, might be able to put it all together and find the single coherent position where everything was properly weighted and so on and so on. And then there's a really one true answer, and that's what I believe. So I think there is, at least as a regulative ideal, I think there are single moral answers to every moral question. It's just that I don't think humans are going to get anywhere near it. And there's nothing else that's going to do it for us either. Sadly, there is no God, or if there is, he doesn't intervene very much. He's not very helpful. But that's what you would need. You would need some kind of super being who would get the coherence right. And so I think that there are moral truths, but humans are very unlikely to agree on what they all are and how they pan out. And it's because it's so difficult, and so to come back to your question a bit, one of the reasons is because it's difficult, we should be reluctant to oppress people. I should be reluctant to force you to agree with me, because there's uncertainty. Now, just be clear here, I think there are thresholds. So I'm perfectly happy to oppress Nazis and nutters. And even though I think, the borderlines there are a bit fuzzy too. So it's sometimes a bit hard to tell who the Nazis and others are, but I think that we're okay, we can oppress them. But once you get above the threshold of the Nazis and the nutters, there are a whole bunch of perfectly reasonable people who disagree. It's just not true that everyone who's pro-life is kind of wicked or stupid, and everyone who's pro-choice is, enlightened and sainted, or vice versa. There are, clever, well-informed people on both sides of that debate. Just happens some of them are wrong. And who knows who they are? Elijah actually.
They're called preemptive strikes when it's the bad guy who gets it. Preemptive strikes. They're called preemptive strikes when it's the bad guy getting it. Oppressed.
Oh, okay.
Oh yeah, yeah. But
I hear what you're saying about human rights.
Yeah.
But it just rolls off the tongue a hell of a lot easier than, say, the exploitation of humanitarian conventional rights. You can't fit that into a
Oh, that's true. The nice example here, the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act is a bit of law, and there's no question about it. It can be repealed. It's a rather toothless bit of legislation. I had a hand in that. It's not a very powerful bit of legislation, and it's just an act, and it's got act at the end of the name to signify that. It is almost word for word the same as the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. They are almost identical, except for the Quebec bits. And the Canadian version is nowhere near as toothless as ours, because it allows the Supreme Court to overrule legislation. But so ours is an act, plainly conventional. Theirs purports to be something else. It purports to be a charter. So you're right. I mean, it does, the conventional model doesn't have quite the same ring, but you can have a Bill of Rights, and that's just sort of neutral.
Which the label has a lot of power. Human rights.
Yeah, no, but notice, but that's the flagging business, isn't it? That goes back to right at the beginning, where you did right. Of course, it does. You call something a right or a human right, it has a rhetorical force to it, and I agree entirely. It's just that if that's what you're after, then indeed you do end up with something like the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which is full of things which just can't be rights. It's just a kind of a wish list of all of the things we think are important. But I take it anyone who sits down and actually goes through that and thinks, how is that a trump? What are we going to do? Who has the duty? Who is this sufficient to say has to do something? It just runs out of steam. So it's just a sort of exhortative document, and that's fine. But I think it won't serve really as a Bill of Rights for a pluralist community. It's a fine thing. But even and so the last speaker last night sort of responded to the other side. I don't know how many people were there, by going through this and saying, I'm for that. I'm for the eradication of sexism and so on and so on. Well, so am I. I'm all for that. Go for it. I'm a moral optimist. It's just that I don't think that the UN Declaration of Human Rights has much to do with it. If you do that, it's because you get people to act. Now, you might do it on first order reasons. You might actually convince people that, look, of course.
Well, actually, so that was a conventional rights list. It was from that. What was it? The Arab.
Yeah, no, it was. But I'm just, but that's what I'm saying.
Well, he was sticking the human rights label on something that.
Yeah, no. Well, it plainly was a human rights document. But I'm just saying, you don't have to think that those are human rights to think they're good. I mean, they could be powerful as conventional rights. They might be more powerful as conventional rights. Where someone actually has the clout to say, you will stop denying people religious freedom, or we'll intervene, or we'll fine you, or whatever. So the conventional rights model might be more powerful, I suspect. Though I think I agree, of course. That's where I began by saying you can have rights as flags. That's fine. Just don't think you're in the rights business, because rights have got to function as trumps if they mean anything. And so the rights as flags, I think, is just a different game. It's the kissing babies, standing for election, all that stuff. It just doesn't do very much. Yeah.
If rights as trumps are differentiated from rights as flags to that extent, how would you create rights if they would be rights as trumps, as opposed to a rights as flags conception where, as something gained momentum as an important feature of your community, you could say it became a right, like
you have
the
to
right.
Trump under the flag.
Oh, yeah, well,
no, I'm saying.
Well,
if
if I understand you, so obviously, on conventional rights, these things don't exist independently of conventions. And so one of the things that happens, presumably, is that you convince people in your community that something should become a right. And certainly, you might flag things as being important. So there's a nice little discussion in this by a guy, McCormick, who says rights and duties can't be logical correlates. So it can't be that every time you have a right, you've already got a duty. Because he thinks that what we in fact do, a sort of historical matter, is go around and identify duties. We identify needs. We see that people are starving. We see that there are needs there. And then we create rights in order to meet the needs. And that sounds plausible. Now, whether a duty exists before the right exists, I'm not sure. But plainly the needs do. We see a need, and then you have an argument and you create a right, or not. And so actually I think historically we're at sort of quite an interesting phase. So I said before that I'm a moral optimist. I think we're making progress. There was a guy, Thomas Pogge, gave a talk last year. I don't know how many people went to it. Quite one of the most interesting things about the talk, I thought, was he said, yes, all of the traditional inequalities have actually reduced. So there's less racial inequality, there's less gender inequality, there's less so on and so on. But there's dramatic increase in economic inequality. And presumably, we might now be at the point historically where we're beginning to think, well, do the citizens of third world countries have a right against the citizens of first world countries to a certain kind of support? And at the moment, they do under the UN Declaration of Human Rights, under the flag, but that doesn't mean anything. It just doesn't have any force. When it'll matter is when someone with sufficient conventional or institutional clout says they have a right against the citizens of first world countries in the trumping sense. So the citizens of first world countries cannot avoid rearranging their tax systems in order to benefit the citizens of third world countries. So that's a nice example, I think, where you have the flag under the UN Declaration, which plainly says everyone has a right to be fed, everyone has a right to shelter, just sort of means nothing. Even here, we're a pretty wealthy country. We could have quite a lot of reduction in our welfare to make people in third world countries better off and still be fine. I mean, I don't need all the shoes I've got. Actually, I probably do. My daughters certainly don't need all the shoes they've got. But it just means nothing to us. It's not until, and unfortunately the international context is difficult because there is no institution who can do it. So part of the reason there's a problem here, there's no set of international conventions which actually bind people. Until there are, people in third world countries don't have rights to be supported. Why? Because they don't have rights as trumps. They do have rights as flags, but what does that mean?
This is what would kind of lend itself to balancing of human rights, like the rights of the first world countries and the rights of the third world countries. Because I was going to say, like, rights going in infringing on other people's rights. So the right for example, global trade can infringe on the rights of decent salary, decent wage. So rights of global trade of first world countries infringing on the rights of third world countries. So how do you balance that?
Well, hopefully I don't actually. So there is a problem, and it's not just from my view, but I think there's a problem with rights view, that if rights are trumps, then as we all know, if you ever play cards, you can't have two trumps of equal value. So somehow, if it turns out that rights are trumps, you need a way of settling rights conflicts. And you can do this. I think what you have to do is say that the rights are not absolute, they're kind of defeasible in some way. But yes, there's a logical point here that if rights are trumps, it can't be true that we both have rights which are directly in conflict, because we won't be able to play out Trump. So we need some meta story, some overarching story about how we resolve those conflicts. And, I think actually what we do is, as Kurt Beyer mentions, we have kind of decision procedures which settle the disputes. Again, very difficult on the international stage. So there's a real problem for the international context. That's just the lack of an international government. There are no international conventions actually, which are anything much more than flags. If the US doesn't like the convention, it ignores it. France doesn't like the convention, it ignores it. And so those conventions don't function as trumps, and that's just a problem for international law. What do you do? Hope for a global government in the fullness of time. Yeah.
Well, you said that something along the lines of that you think you're no better judge of moral issues than anyone else. I mean, that seems a bit questionable to me. I mean, would you not say that you, especially as someone who studied sort of moral philosophy a bit, have it maybe a bit more of an idea than, say, some racist yokel or something like that?
Well, of course the answer is yes. So I think I may have said I don't know better than anyone else, but I've also said I'm pretty confident I'm right. But actually, I don't think that's because of my training particularly, though. I mean, I think so. So this is a slightly different topic. I do think there's such a thing as moral expertise, but I think it's a very mundane procedural matter. So I think as I said to someone here before, I think what morality consists in is just constructing all pretty ordinary arguments. So I don't think there are moral truths out there. I think there are moral theories. You know, there's consequentialist theories and rights theories and character theories and so on and so on. And what those theories do is elaborate sort of common and important moral concerns. So it's not that you know, the consequentialist view which says the right thing to do is the thing which has the best consequences, a kind of cost-benefit story. It's not that that's the right moral theory. What is true is that consequences matter in moral deliberation. They just have to. And so what the consequentialists do is work out in great detail what a concern for consequences should lead you to think about. And the rights theorists work out in great detail what a concern for rights should lead you to think about. So the idea is that those moral theories are really just elaborations of important moral concerns. And so what moral expertise consists in is in part a knowledge of those theories. It's not that the moral theorists can see the moral truth, but they can help people construct this kind of discourse and point out to them when there are common errors and the sort of thing that you overlook or the mistakes you make. That's what moral expertise consists in, I think. Now, do I think I have that? Well, you know, maybe. I mean, it sounds a bit modest actually, but maybe I have that. But notice it is just a kind of procedural skill. Now, I certainly don't have any truck with giving any kind of moral expert the say to impose their view on others. But actually, I think one of the things a moral expert had better think is that most people are pretty competent moral judges. You know, there are the race jokers. You know, we can oppress them. You know, they're below the threshold. We just have the small task of working out who they are. So I don't think anyone gets to say, you know, I'm right about this, I can force you to do it. And you know, I think as I said before, there's two parts to that. There's both the moral question. You know, you're a special moral agent just as I am, and provided you're not plainly below the threshold, I should respect you as a moral agent. And the other thing is that oppression is very demanding. It's hard work, and so we don't want to go into that if we can help it.
I'm sorry for interfering, but was there an iPod left in the classroom?
Yes, there was. It was given to Ben Smith, who was just behind you, I think.
Never mind global suffering.
My second question.
Yeah, sure.
Yes, thank you. New Zealand has been nominated as the most peaceful nation and rights and research institute since long. And I have considered about that by myself. First, financially and economically rich.
Sorry, I just missed the last bit of the sentence.
Rich.
Yeah.
I considered the reason why New Zealand has been nominated as the most peaceful nation in the world. And the first, you have told by yourself that New Zealand is rich economically and financially independent. And second, geopolitically and isolated.
Yeah.
In spite of the fact that New Zealand has participated in the deployment of the military forces in foreign countries through the